The autumn sun cast long shadows across Zilker Park as hundreds of Hayes Digital Solutions employees and their families gathered for the annual company picnic. Children's laughter mixed with the sounds of acoustic guitars from local bands, while the aroma of barbecue filled the crisp October air. Victoria Hayes stood on the small stage, her navy blazer immaculate despite the casual setting, addressing the crowd through a wireless microphone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This company has always been about bringing families together through technology, she declared, gesturing toward the colorful banner displaying their latest educational app. A local news reporter positioned near the front with her cameraman suddenly stepped forward during the Q&A session. "Miss Hayes, there are rumors about your company's janitor having inappropriate access to your daughter. Some parents are concerned about background checks for service staff around their children. What's your response?" The question cut through the festive atmosphere like a blade. Victoria's eyes immediately found Michael Torres, who was emptying trash bins near the playground equipment, wearing his standard gray uniform with Torres embroidered on the pocket. He had frozen mid-motion, a garbage bag halfway into the bin, his face visible to everyone present. Without hesitation, Victoria's voice carried across the entire gathering as she pointed directly at him. "I would never allow a janitor near my daughter. Our family maintains appropriate boundaries with all service personnel." The words hung in the air like smoke from the barbecue grills. Michael slowly straightened, his eyes meeting Victoria's across the crowded park. For a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely, their gazes locked. His expression showed no anger, only a deep resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd been dismissed based on his occupation. Then he quietly finished his task and walked toward the maintenance shed, disappearing from view. The reporter nodded, satisfied with the response, while the crowd gradually returned to their conversations and activities. Victoria stepped down from the stage, but the confident mask she'd worn moments before began to crack around the edges. Victoria Hayes had built her digital empire on the foundation of perfection and control. At 42, she commanded Hayes Digital Solutions from the 32nd floor of Austin's most prestigious business tower, overseeing a company that created educational technology for children across the globe. Her corner office overlooked the downtown skyline, its walls lined with awards recognizing her innovations in adaptive learning software. Every aspect of her life operated according to carefully calculated systems. She arrived at the office each morning at 7 sharp, reviewed overnight data analytics while drinking precisely 1 cup of Ethiopian coffee, and conducted her first meeting by 7:30. Her daily schedule was color-coded and synchronized across multiple devices, with contingencies built in for every possible scenario. The company headquarters reflected her exacting standards. The lobby featured interactive displays showcasing their award-winning learning platforms, while soft lighting and modern furniture created an atmosphere that somehow managed to be both welcoming and intimidating. Employees moved through the open-concept workspace with the focused efficiency of people who understood that mediocrity wasn't tolerated. Victoria's success hadn't come easily. When her father Robert Hayes died unexpectedly 3 years ago, she'd inherited a company in transition. The board of directors had questioned whether she possessed the technical expertise to lead a software development firm, despite her Stanford MBA and computer science background from UT Austin. Competitors had circled like vultures, attempting to poach key clients and talented developers. She had responded by transforming herself into something harder than the titanium frames of her designer glasses. Every decision was analyzed through multiple metrics. Every relationship was evaluated for its strategic value. Every emotion was carefully contained behind a professional facade that had become as much a part of her as her perfectly styled auburn hair. Her penthouse apartment in Westlake Hills showcased the same pristine control as her office. Museum-quality furniture arranged with mathematical precision, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Austin. The space was beautiful, sophisticated, and utterly devoid of warmth. Men approached Victoria regularly, drawn by her success, her striking appearance, or the power she wielded in Austin's tech community. Investment partners with calculated charm, software executives seeking strategic alliances, wealthy entrepreneurs who viewed marriage as another type of merger. She had dated several of them, relationships that felt like extended job interviews conducted over expensive wine at the city's finest restaurants. None of them had ever seen her struggle with Emma's meltdowns at 3 in the morning. None had witnessed her researching autism therapies until dawn, desperately trying to understand how to help her daughter navigate a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. None had ever heard her cry in her car after particularly difficult parent-teacher conferences, where well-meaning educators suggested that Emma might be happier in a more specialized environment. The divorce from Christopher Manning had been finalized 18 months ago, a clinical dissolution of a marriage that had been more strategic partnership than love story. Christopher, a successful commercial real estate developer, had initially seemed like the perfect complement to her driven personality. But when Emma's autism diagnosis arrived, he'd gradually withdrawn, uncomfortable with the unpredictability that special needs parenting required. He'd wanted the version of family life that appeared in his company's marketing materials. Perfectly arranged children who smiled on command, dinner parties where conversation flowed smoothly without sudden interruptions or sensory overload episodes. When it became clear that Emma would never fit that mold, Christopher had simply removed himself from the equation, citing irreconcilable differences while fighting for minimal custody arrangements. Now Victoria carried the weight of single parenthood alongside the responsibilities of running a major corporation. She had nannies and assistants, carefully vetted professionals who helped manage the logistics of Emma's complex needs. But the deep aching responsibility of being Emma's primary advocate, protector and interpreter in a world that often misunderstood autism, rested solely on her shoulders. 28 floors below Victoria's executive suite, Michael Torres moved through the building like a specter, arriving each evening as the last executives departed for their suburban homes. His world existed in the spaces others never noticed: supply closets, utility rooms and corridors that remained empty after business hours. The Hayes Digital Solutions headquarters transformed completely after sunset.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The bustling energy of daytime meetings and collaborative sessions gave way to the quiet hum of servers and the soft footsteps of security guards making their rounds. Michael knew every corner of this building, every elevator's particular sound, every light switch that controlled the maze of modern workspace design. His territory included everything from the executive floors to the underground parking garage. He cleaned conference rooms where million-dollar deals were negotiated, offices where breakthrough educational software was designed, and break rooms where exhausted developers fueled themselves with energy drinks and determination. Michael had not always been invisible. 7 years ago he had been Dr. Michael Torres, a child psychologist specializing in autism spectrum disorders. His practice in East Austin had been small but highly regarded among families seeking alternatives to traditional behavioral interventions. He'd spent his days helping children like Emma learn to navigate social interactions, manage sensory challenges, and develop communication strategies that worked with their unique neurological wiring rather than against it. His approach had been revolutionary for its time, focusing on understanding autism as a different way of experiencing the world rather than a disorder to be corrected. Parents drove from across Texas to bring their children to his clinic, drawn by his reputation for achieving breakthroughs where other therapists had failed. He'd been married to Jennifer, a music teacher with an infectious laugh and an intuitive understanding of how rhythm and melody could unlock communication pathways in non-verbal children. Their small house near the university had been filled with the sounds of Jennifer's piano students practicing scales, while Michael worked on research papers that were beginning to gain national attention in psychological journals. Then came the malpractice lawsuit that destroyed everything. Marcus Webb, the father of one of Michael's patients, had filed a complaint alleging that Michael's unconventional methods had delayed his son's progress. The boy, a 6-year-old with severe autism, had been making steady improvements under Michael's care, but Marcus had expected faster results and more dramatic changes. The lawsuit was groundless from a medical standpoint, but the legal process became a nightmare that consumed Michael's savings and reputation. Other parents, influenced by Marcus's public accusations, began withdrawing their children from his practice. Professional colleagues, fearing association with controversy, distanced themselves from his research. The most devastating blow came when the state licensing board launched an investigation based on Marcus's complaints. While Michael was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, The process took 18 months and left his practice financially ruined. The legal fees had consumed everything he'd built, including his marriage. Jennifer had tried to support him through the crisis, but watching him transform from the confident, passionate therapist she'd married into someone consumed by legal battles and professional humiliation had slowly eroded their relationship. The stress had affected his health, his sleep, his ability to be present for the people who needed him most. When their son Daniel was born during the worst of the legal proceedings, Michael had been too overwhelmed to be the father he'd always planned to become. Jennifer had found herself essentially raising their baby alone while her husband fought to salvage what remained of his career. The divorce papers had arrived on Daniel's first birthday, along with Jennifer's job offer from a music conservatory in Colorado. She'd remarried 2 years later, to a music professor who offered the stability and emotional presence that Michael hadn't been able to provide during those dark months. Michael had fought for joint custody of Daniel, but the court had awarded him limited visitation due to his unstable employment situation. The arrangement allowed Daniel to spend summers and some holidays with his father, precious weeks that Michael treasured more than anything else in his carefully reconstructed life. The janitorial position at Hayes Digital Solutions had been offered by a former colleague who remembered Michael from better days. The work was honest and necessary, and the night shift paid enough to cover his modest apartment rent and Daniel's support payments. More importantly, it allowed him to spend afternoons with his son during the custody periods, helping with homework and taking him to the parks around Austin. Daniel was 7 now, with Jennifer's musical ear and Michael's careful attention to detail. He never asked why his father cleaned buildings instead of helping children, accepting their circumstances with the resilience that children often demonstrate when adults cannot. When Daniel visited, he would help Michael prepare dinner in their small kitchen, chattering about school and friends while unconsciously teaching his father how to hope again. During the months when Daniel was in Colorado, Michael filled the silence by volunteering at a local autism support group, quietly using his professional knowledge to help other parents navigate challenges he understood all too well. He never mentioned his credentials or background, simply offering practical suggestions drawn from years of clinical experience. The night of the company picnic, Michael had been scheduled for weekend maintenance duties. A coffee spill in the executive conference room required deep cleaning, and he'd wanted to complete the work before Monday morning meetings resumed. He'd been focused on removing stains from imported carpet when he overheard his name being discussed on the small television in the break room, tuned to the local news coverage of the picnic. The aftermath of Victoria's public statement rippled through the building like aftershocks from an earthquake. By Monday morning, everyone knew about the incident. Security guards who had previously nodded respectfully when he passed now watched him with suspicious eyes. Day shift maintenance workers avoided conversation, uncertain how to interact with someone who'd been publicly identified as potentially dangerous around children. The executive assistants who had barely acknowledged his existence now stared openly when he worked near their desks, their expressions mixing pity with embarrassment. Some seemed genuinely uncomfortable with how their CEO had handled the situation, but none spoke up or offered support. Michael absorbed the changed atmosphere without comment or complaint. He'd learned during the malpractice lawsuit that defending himself often made situations worse, that people preferred simple narratives over complex truths. He simply continued his work, disappearing into the familiar rhythms that had sustained him through darker periods. Empty the waste baskets, check the supply inventory, polish the brass fixtures in the lobby until they reflected the city lights like mirrors of a life he used to lead. Vacuum the conference rooms where important decisions were made by people who would never learn his real story. The work itself provided a meditation of sorts, repetitive tasks that allowed his mind to focus on concrete problems with clear solutions. Unlike the ambiguous challenges of child psychology or the emotional complexities of failed marriage, cleaning offered immediate, visible results that no one could dispute or undermine. As he moved through the building each night, Michael sometimes paused at the displays showcasing Hayes Digital Solutions' educational software. The company's mission statement, prominently featured in the lobby, spoke of empowering every child to reach their full potential through innovative learning technology. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his nights maintaining a building dedicated to helping children like the ones he'd once treated professionally. Victoria's daughter Emma had been attending Riverside Elementary for 2 years, though Victoria knew remarkably little about her daily experience there. The school's special education program was highly rated, with dedicated staff members who understood autism spectrum needs and individualized learning plans designed to help children like Emma thrive. Emma was 8 years old, with Victoria's auburn hair and Christopher's green eyes, but her way of experiencing the world was entirely her own. She communicated primarily through gestures and expressions, finding verbal language overwhelming in most social situations. Her intelligence manifested in unexpected ways, an extraordinary memory for number patterns, an ability to solve complex puzzles that frustrated adults, and an intuitive understanding of technology that amazed her teachers. At home, Emma navigated their penthouse apartment with practiced efficiency, following routines that provided the predictability she needed to feel secure. She had her special corner near the windows where she could watch the patterns of traffic lights changing across the city, a visual rhythm that seemed to calm her nervous system when the world became too much. Victoria had tried everything to connect with her daughter: expensive therapists, specialized communication devices, adaptive toys recommended by autism experts, but Emma remained largely unreachable, responding to Victoria's attempts at engagement with polite tolerance rather than enthusiasm. The gulf between them felt as vast as the distance between Victoria's executive suite and the maintenance areas where people like Michael Torres worked invisibly. The upcoming Saturday at Zilker Park was intended to be a rare opportunity for Victoria to combine her professional responsibilities with family time. The annual company picnic allowed her to demonstrate leadership while supposedly creating memories with Emma. She'd planned the event meticulously, arranging for quiet spaces where Emma could retreat if the crowds became overwhelming, hiring additional security to ensure safety, and scheduling activities designed to appeal to families with diverse needs. But as Saturday morning arrived, Victoria found herself approaching the event with the same strategic mindset she brought to board meetings. She reviewed contingency plans, confirmed vendor arrangements, and prepared remarks designed to reinforce Hayes Digital Solutions' commitment to family values and community engagement. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Victoria's Tesla, wearing noise-canceling headphones and focusing intently on her tablet screen, where colorful geometric patterns shifted and evolved according to algorithms she seemed to understand instinctively. She tolerated these public appearances because Victoria explained their importance, but Emma's compliance came from a desire to please rather than genuine enjoyment. As they drove toward Zilker Park, Victoria practiced her speech mentally, anticipating questions from local media, and preparing responses that would position the company favorably while demonstrating her effectiveness as both CEO and mother. She had no way of knowing that this carefully planned event would become the catalyst for changes that would transform not only her understanding of Emma, but her comprehension of what it meant to truly see another human being. The morning sun climbing higher over Austin's skyline promised a perfect day for the picnic, with clear skies and temperatures ideal for outdoor activities. Victoria checked her phone one final time before parking, confirming that all arrangements were proceeding according to schedule. Emma looked up from her tablet briefly as they approached the park entrance, taking in the sight of families already gathering near the Hayes Digital Solutions banners. Her expression remained neutral, but Victoria noticed the slight tension in her daughter's shoulders that indicated sensory processing of new environment. Neither of them could have predicted that before the day ended, Emma would disappear into the chaos of the crowd, that Michael Torres would abandon his maintenance duties to search for her, or that the words Emma would whisper when she was finally found would reveal secrets that changed everything. Both women thought they knew about their carefully constructed lives. Victoria's empire demanded nothing less than absolute precision. Each morning at 6:15, her phone alarm pierced the silence of her West Lake Hills penthouse with the efficiency of a surgical instrument. By 6:30, she was reviewing overnight analytics from their global user base while Ethiopian coffee brewed in her high-end espresso machine. The ritual never varied: check server performance metrics from their Asian markets, scan overnight customer support tickets, review preliminary data from beta testing programs. Her morning routine flowed with the mechanical perfection she demanded from every aspect of Hayes Digital Solutions. Shower precisely timed to conserve water while maintaining luxury. Wardrobe selected based on day's strategic objectives: navy for board meetings, charcoal for investor presentations, burgundy for media interviews. Breakfast consisted of protein-optimized smoothies consumed while reading industry reports that kept her ahead of emerging trends. The drive from her hilltop residence to downtown Austin followed the same route every day, timing calculated to avoid traffic patterns that might disrupt her schedule. She used the 22-minute commute to mentally rehearse key talking points for morning meetings, review quarterly projections, and prepare responses to anticipated challenges from board members who still questioned some of her strategic decisions. Hayes Digital Solutions headquarters rose 32 stories above downtown Austin, a gleaming monument to innovation that Victoria's father had envisioned but never lived to see completed. The lobby featured interactive displays showcasing their latest educational platforms, with adaptive interfaces that responded to different learning styles and abilities. Soft lighting and carefully selected artwork created an atmosphere that balanced professional sophistication with child-friendly warmth. Victoria's corner office commanded views of the Texas State Capitol and the University of Texas campus beyond. The space reflected her personality through its organized minimalism, awards and recognitions arranged with mathematical precision, bookshelves containing technical manuals and leadership texts organized alphabetically, and a standing desk that could be adjusted to optimize productivity throughout the day. The walls displayed photographs from industry conferences where she'd delivered keynote addresses on adaptive learning technology. Images of her shaking hands with education ministers from various countries, accepting innovation awards, and speaking at universities about the future of digital learning. Each frame positioned at angles calculated to create visual balance while communicating authority and expertise. Her daily schedule operated like clockwork. 7:30 brought meetings with development teams working on artificial intelligence algorithms that could personalize learning experiences for children with diverse cognitive needs. 8:15 included strategy sessions with marketing directors planning campaigns for new product launches. 9 o'clock meant reviewing financial projections with her CFO, analyzing market penetration data, and competitor movements with the precision of a chess grandmaster anticipating opponents' strategies. The company employed over 400 people across 3 office locations, with additional contractors and consultants contributing to projects worldwide. Victoria knew every department head personally, understood their individual strengths and weaknesses, and could recite quarterly performance metrics for each division without consulting notes. Board meetings revealed the ongoing challenges of leading a technology company in an industry dominated by larger corporations with deeper resources. Competitors regularly attempted to poach her most talented developers with offers that stretched her salary budget. Venture capital firms pressured her to scale faster, sometimes at the expense of product quality. Educational institutions demanded increasingly sophisticated features while remaining resistant to premium pricing structures. Victoria had learned to navigate these pressures by becoming something harder than the sapphire screens protecting their mobile applications. Every decision was analyzed through multiple scenarios. Every relationship was evaluated for strategic value. Every emotion was carefully contained behind a professional mask that had become as natural as breathing. Client dinners occurred 3 evenings per week, elegant affairs at Austin's finest restaurants where she discussed platform integration possibilities with school district administrators and technology directors. These conversations required delicate balance, demonstrating product capabilities without overwhelming non-technical decision-makers, building personal relationships while maintaining professional boundaries, and negotiating contracts that ensured profitability while remaining competitive. The social circuit included monthly charity galas supporting causes related to education and child development. Victoria wrote substantial checks for autism research organizations, literacy programs for underserved communities, and technology access initiatives for rural schools. These events provided networking opportunities while allowing her to demonstrate corporate social responsibility that enhanced Hayes Digital Solutions' reputation. Her penthouse apartment reflected the same controlled perfection as her office environment. Museum-quality furniture selected by interior designers who understood her preference for clean lines and neutral colors. A kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances that remained largely unused due to her demanding schedule. floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Austin, where she sometimes stood with her evening wine, watching sunset reflections on the water while mentally reviewing the day's accomplishments and tomorrow's challenges. Men approached Victoria regularly at industry events and social gatherings, drawn by her success, striking appearance and the power she wielded in Austin's competitive technology landscape. Software executives from Silicon Valley seeking strategic partnerships, investment bankers proposing acquisition scenarios, politicians hoping to leverage her influence in education policy discussions. She dated selectively, relationships that often felt like extended negotiations conducted over expensive wine and carefully prepared conversations. None of these carefully orchestrated relationships had ever penetrated the fortress she'd constructed around her deepest vulnerabilities. None had witnessed her researching autism therapy techniques at 3 in the morning, when Emma experienced sensory overload episodes. None had seen her crying in hospital parking lots after inconclusive medical consultations that offered no clear answers about how to help her daughter navigate a world that often seemed hostile to neurological differences. The divorce from Christopher Manning had been executed with the same strategic precision she applied to business mergers, though the emotional aftermath proved far more complex than anticipated. Christopher's departure had removed a source of constant criticism about Emma's progress, but it had also eliminated the illusion of shared responsibility for their daughter's future. Christopher's new wife, a marketing executive with no children of her own, had made it clear that Emma's unpredictable behaviors were unwelcome during the minimal custody visits he'd negotiated. Emma's overnight stays at their suburban mansion became increasingly rare, then eventually ceased altogether when Christopher cited scheduling conflicts that conveniently aligned with his stepson's soccer tournaments and his wife's dinner parties. Victoria had fought these changes through family court proceedings that drained both her energy and bank account, but ultimately accepted that forcing unwilling participation in Emma's care would benefit no one. She'd increased Emma's therapy sessions and hired additional support staff to compensate for the absence of paternal involvement. The weight of single parenthood pressed down on Victoria like atmospheric pressure at ocean depths. Every decision about Emma's education, medical care, and social development rested solely on her shoulders. Specialists offered conflicting advice about intervention strategies. Educational consultants recommended programs that contradicted recommendations from behavioral therapists. Insurance companies denied coverage for treatments that might genuinely help her daughter progress. Emma's autism manifested in ways that defied simple categorization. Her intelligence was undeniable, demonstrated through her remarkable ability to solve complex pattern puzzles and her intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships. But traditional communication remained elusive, leaving Victoria to interpret gestures, expressions, and behaviors that sometimes felt like attempting to decode messages from an alien civilization. The most painful moments occurred during Emma's meltdowns when sensory overload triggered responses that Victoria felt powerless to prevent or soothe. The sound of emergency vehicles passing their building could send Emma into hours of distress. Unexpected changes in routine might result in self-injurious behaviors that broke Victoria's heart while filling her with helpless frustration. Victoria had read every book, consulted every expert, and researched every intervention technique available to parents of autistic children. She'd attended conferences in other cities, connected with online support groups, and experimented with dietary modifications, sensory integration therapies, and communication technologies that promised breakthrough results. Yet Emma remained largely unreachable, responding to Victoria's efforts with polite tolerance rather than genuine engagement. The gulf between them felt as vast as the distance between Victoria's executive suite and the underground parking garage where service employees like Michael Torres remained invisible to the corporate world above. Victoria's professional success in developing educational technology for special needs children created an ironic contrast to her struggles connecting with her own daughter. The adaptive learning platform she oversaw helped thousands of children with autism spectrum disorders make educational progress, but Emma showed little interest in the very products that had built their family's fortune. Late at night, when the building was empty except for security guards and cleaning crews, Victoria sometimes remained in her office reviewing videos of Emma interacting with various therapists and teachers. She studied these recordings like a scientist analyzing experimental data, searching for patterns that might unlock the mystery of her daughter's internal world. The annual company picnic at Zilker Park represented Victoria's attempt to bridge her professional and personal responsibilities, creating an event that demonstrated family values while showcasing corporate culture. She'd planned every detail with characteristic precision: accessible activities for children with diverse needs, quiet spaces for sensory breaks, security measures that ensured safety without creating an atmosphere of surveillance. Emma's participation in these public events required careful preparation and constant monitoring. Victoria hired specialized childcare providers who understood autism spectrum behaviors, arranged backup plans for sensory overload episodes, and maintained emergency contacts with Emma's therapy team in case professional intervention became necessary. The morning of the picnic had begun according to Victoria's carefully orchestrated schedule. Emma had awakened at her usual time, followed her established routine, and accepted the explanation that they would be attending a company event where she could explore the park while Victoria fulfilled professional obligations. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Victoria's Tesla Model S, wearing her preferred noise-canceling headphones and focusing intently on her tablet display. The device showed geometric patterns that shifted and evolved according to mathematical algorithms Emma seemed to understand intuitively. These visual sequences provided comfort and stimulation that helped her process challenging environments. Victoria had learned to interpret Emma's subtle behavioral cues that indicated stress levels and sensory processing states. The slight tension in her daughter's shoulders suggested awareness of approaching challenges, but Emma's willingness to engage with her tablet indicated manageable anxiety levels. As they approached Zilker Park, Victoria reviewed her mental checklist one final time. Speech prepared for media interviews, contingency plans activated for potential problems, support staff positioned throughout the event area. She had no way of anticipating that this meticulously planned afternoon would become the catalyst for revelations that would transform her understanding of not only Emma, but the hidden lives of people working invisibly around her every day. The park entrance bustled with Hayes Digital Solutions families arriving for the picnic, children running toward playground equipment, while parents carried coolers and blankets. Victoria noticed several local news vehicles parked near the main pavilion, confirming that her public relations team had successfully generated media interest in the event. Emma observed the gathering crowds through the car window, her expression remaining neutral while processing the sensory information of voices, movement, and unfamiliar visual stimuli. Victoria recognized the careful assessment her daughter performed before entering new environments, a survival strategy that helped Emma navigate social situations that could quickly become overwhelming. The morning progressed according to Victoria's timeline, with employees arriving in family groups, vendors setting up food stations and activity areas, and local musicians beginning sound checks for afternoon entertainment. Victoria had insisted on acoustic performances rather than amplified music, understanding that loud sounds could trigger distress for children like Emma, who experienced auditory sensitivity. By 10:30, over 300 people had gathered in the designated picnic area, creating the kind of cheerful family atmosphere that Victoria hoped would generate positive media coverage while providing genuine enjoyment for her employees and their children. She moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, greeting key personnel, acknowledging family members, and positioning herself for scheduled interviews. Emma remained close to Victoria's side, occasionally reaching for her mother's hand when the sensory input became intense. Victoria had arranged for a quiet retreat area near the park's community center, complete with comfortable seating and sensory tools that Emma could access if needed. The first indication that something might go wrong came when a local news reporter approached with questions that veered away from corporate culture and community engagement toward more personal territory. Victoria's carefully prepared responses suddenly felt inadequate when faced with inquiries about her family life and the challenges of balancing executive responsibilities with single motherhood. The reporter's questions about service personnel and background checks caught Victoria completely off guard, forcing her to make split-second decisions about how to respond to suggestions that felt more like accusations than legitimate journalism. In that moment, standing on the small stage with hundreds of eyes watching her reaction, Victoria's instinct for protecting her reputation and authority overrode her capacity for compassion and fairness. The words that came out of her mouth would haunt her for weeks afterward, but in that instant they felt like the only way to maintain control of a situation that threatened to spiral beyond her management. She pointed toward Michael Torres, identifying him publicly as someone she would never allow near her daughter, not because she knew anything about his character or background, but because his uniform marked him as different from the corporate culture she'd worked so hard to build and protect. As Michael walked away from the gathering, disappearing into the maintenance shed with quiet dignity that somehow made Victoria's declaration seem even more cruel. She felt something crack inside her chest. But the damage was done, broadcast live to the local Austin community and recorded for posterity by news cameras that had captured her moment of profound moral failure. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced cheerfulness and mounting anxiety. Victoria continued her planned activities, delivered her prepared remarks about corporate values and community engagement, and smiled for photographs that would later appear in business journals and local newspapers. But beneath the professional facade, she struggled with growing awareness that she had publicly humiliated someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Emma remained unusually quiet throughout the morning events, staying closer to Victoria than normal and displaying increased sensitivity to the crowd noise and activity around them. Victoria attributed her daughter's behavior to the general stimulation of the picnic environment, not recognizing that Emma might have witnessed and processed the interaction with Michael Torres in ways that her mother couldn't understand. As lunchtime approached, Victoria found herself scanning the park for any sign of Michael, though she couldn't articulate why his presence or absence mattered to her. The maintenance shed remained closed, and she realized that her public statement had effectively banished him from participating in an event that was supposed to celebrate the entire Hayes Digital Solutions community. The afternoon entertainment was scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock, with local musicians performing family-friendly acoustic sets while children participated in organized games and activities. Victoria had planned to use this time for informal networking with employees and their spouses, building relationships that would strengthen company culture and loyalty. But as the crowds grew larger and the noise levels increased, Victoria noticed Emma becoming increasingly agitated. Her daughter's stimming behaviors intensified, and she began covering her ears despite wearing noise-canceling headphones. Victoria recognized the signs of approaching sensory overload, and began guiding Emma toward the quiet retreat area she'd established near the community center. The path to the retreat space required walking past the maintenance shed where Michael Torres had disappeared earlier that morning. As they approached the small building, Victoria felt a complicated mix of guilt, curiosity, and something she couldn't quite identify. The shed appeared empty, but she found herself wondering about the man she'd so casually dismissed, the person whose feelings she'd disregarded in favor of protecting her own image. Emma suddenly stopped walking, pulling away from Victoria's guiding hand and staring intently at something near the maintenance shed. Victoria followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual, just standard park maintenance equipment, gardening tools and storage containers that held supplies for events like their company picnic. But Emma's behavior suggested she'd noticed something significant, something that captured her attention in ways that social gatherings and corporate activities never could. Victoria had learned to pay attention to Emma's focused interest, understanding that her daughter often perceived details and patterns that escaped typical observation. As they stood there in the growing afternoon heat, with the sounds of the picnic continuing in the distance, Victoria had no way of knowing that within a few hours, Emma would disappear into the crowd, that Michael Torres would abandon his maintenance duties to search for her, and that the crisis would reveal truths about her daughter, her company, and herself that would challenge every assumption she'd made about the carefully ordered world she'd constructed. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did that afternoon at Zilker Park, though Victoria couldn't yet articulate why her successful company picnic felt like the beginning of something that would change everything she thought she understood about the people whose lives intersected with her own in ways she'd never bothered to notice or acknowledge. The weight of Victoria's family legacy pressed down on her shoulders like the humid Austin air that clung to the city during summer months. When her father Robert Hayes collapsed in his home office 3 years ago, clutching architectural plans for the company's new headquarters while reviewing code for their breakthrough autism learning platform, Victoria had been presenting quarterly results to the board of directors in the conference room down the hall. The call from emergency services came at precisely 2:17 in the afternoon, interrupting her detailed analysis of market penetration statistics with news that would fracture her world into before and after. Robert Hayes, the visionary who had built educational technology solutions from a small software consulting business into a major player in adaptive learning systems, was dead at 59 from a massive heart attack that gave no warning and offered no second chances. Victoria remembered the sterile hospital waiting room where she'd sat for hours after the paramedics' efforts proved futile, staring at fluorescent lights while trying to process the reality that her father's brilliant mind had simply stopped working. The man who had taught her to see technology as a tool for democratizing education, who had shown her how algorithms could adapt to individual learning differences, who had believed that every child deserved personalized pathways to knowledge, was gone. The board of directors had questioned whether Victoria possessed the technical depth to lead Hayes Digital Solutions into its next phase of growth. Despite her Stanford MBA and University of Texas computer science degree, despite her 5 years of increasingly responsible roles within the company, despite her intimate knowledge of their product development cycles and market strategies, there were whispers about nepotism and concerns about continuity of leadership. Competitors had sensed vulnerability in the leadership transition, immediately beginning recruitment efforts targeting Hayes Digital Solutions' most talented developers. Tech Innovations, their primary rival in the adaptive learning space, had made offers to 3 senior engineers within a week of Robert's funeral. Educational software giants from Silicon Valley had approached key clients with proposals to migrate their platforms to more stable technology providers. Industry publications had run speculative articles about potential acquisition targets, with Hayes Digital Solutions appearing prominently in discussions about companies that might struggle with succession planning. Investment analysts had downgraded their stock recommendations, citing uncertainty about the company's future direction under new leadership. Victoria's response had been to transform herself into something harder than the titanium alloys used in their server architecture. She'd worked 18-hour days for months, personally reviewing every line of code in their core products, memorizing technical specifications that she could recite to skeptical engineers who questioned her competence. She'd attended advanced programming courses at night while managing the company during the day, determined to prove that leadership capability transcended gender expectations and family relationships. The transformation hadn't been merely professional. Victoria had systematically eliminated aspects of her personality that might be perceived as weakness. Spontaneous laughter became calculated responses designed to build rapport with specific audiences. Emotional reactions were analyzed for strategic value before being expressed. Personal relationships were evaluated through cost-benefit frameworks that prioritized corporate objectives over human connection. She developed a reputation for brilliance tempered by ruthlessness, making decisions that prioritized long-term market position over short-term popularity. When budget constraints required reducing staff, she'd implemented layoffs with surgical precision, eliminating redundancies while preserving core competencies. When product deadlines conflicted with employee work-life balance, she'd chosen market advantage over sentiment. The strategy had succeeded beyond most projections. Hayes Digital Solutions had not only survived the leadership transition, but had expanded into new markets and developed innovative products that set industry standards for adaptive learning technology. Their autism-focused educational platforms had won international recognition, their artificial intelligence algorithms had been licensed by major school districts, and their revenue had grown by 40% over 3 years. But success had come at personal cost that Victoria was only beginning to understand. The woman who had once enjoyed impromptu dinners with friends, who had taken weekend trips to explore Texas Hill Country, who had spent hours reading poetry and playing piano, had been replaced by someone who scheduled relaxation like business meetings, and evaluated every social interaction for its potential impact on corporate objectives. Marriage to Christopher Manning had seemed like the logical next step in building a stable foundation for continued success. Christopher's commercial real estate development company complemented her technology focus, creating opportunities for strategic collaboration. His family connections in Austin's business community provided networking advantages. His financial stability offered security during uncertain periods of company growth. The relationship had functioned efficiently rather than passionately, a partnership built on shared goals and compatible lifestyles rather than emotional intimacy. Their conversations focused on portfolio diversification, property investments, and 5-year plans for expanding their respective business operations. They'd attended charity galas and industry conferences together, presenting an image of successful young professionals building a life that reflected Austin's aspirational culture. Emma's arrival had initially seemed to fit seamlessly into their carefully constructed plans. Victoria had continued working throughout her pregnancy, attending board meetings until the day before delivery and returning to the office within 6 weeks of childbirth. Christopher had hired nannies and household staff to manage the logistics of infant care while maintaining their professional commitments and social obligations. The first signs that Emma might develop differently from typical children had been subtle. Delayed eye contact that pediatricians dismissed as individual variation, sensory sensitivities that seemed more intense than normal infant responses, social engagement patterns that didn't match developmental milestone charts but weren't concerning enough to trigger immediate intervention. When Emma's autism diagnosis arrived at 18 months, delivered by a developmental pediatrician in language that tried to be encouraging while acknowledging significant challenges ahead, Victoria had approached the news with the same systematic problem-solving methodology she applied to technical obstacles at work. She'd researched intervention strategies, consulted multiple specialists, and developed comprehensive treatment plans designed to optimize Emma's developmental trajectory. Christopher's response had been more complicated. He'd initially supported Victoria's intensive intervention efforts, agreeing to therapy schedules and dietary modifications that required substantial lifestyle adjustments. But as months passed without dramatic improvements, as Emma's behaviors continued to diverge from typical developmental patterns, as their social circle began excluding them from gatherings that couldn't accommodate Emma's needs, Christopher had gradually withdrawn from active participation in his daughter's care. The breaking point had come during a dinner party at their home, when Emma had experienced a meltdown triggered by unexpected doorbell sounds from late-arriving guests. Her screaming had continued for 40 minutes despite Victoria's attempts at soothing, disrupting the evening's carefully planned networking opportunities with potential investors. Christopher had stood in their kitchen afterward, surrounded by abandoned appetizers and half-empty wine glasses, telling Victoria that they needed to consider more structured care options for Emma. Victoria had realized in that moment that Christopher wanted the appearance of family life without accepting the reality of their actual family. He'd envisioned children who would enhance his professional image, attend corporate functions as charming accessories, and require minimal disruption to the lifestyle he'd established before becoming a father. Emma's autism fundamentally challenged those expectations, demanding flexibility, patience, and unconditional acceptance that Christopher seemed incapable of providing. The divorce proceedings had been conducted with the same strategic precision Victoria applied to corporate acquisitions, though the emotional aftermath proved far more complex than anticipated. Christopher had negotiated minimal custody arrangements, citing his demanding travel schedule and Emma's specialized needs as justification for limited involvement in her daily care. His new wife, a marketing executive named Patricia, who had no experience with special needs children, had made it clear through polite but firm boundaries that Emma's unpredictable behaviors were unwelcome during the few custody visits Christopher maintained. Emma's overnight stays at their suburban mansion had become increasingly infrequent, then eventually ceased altogether when Christopher cited scheduling conflicts that conveniently aligned with his stepson's activities and Patricia's social commitments. Victoria had fought these changes through family court proceedings that consumed both emotional energy and financial resources, but ultimately accepted that forcing unwilling participation in Emma's care would benefit no one. She'd increased therapy sessions and hired additional support staff to compensate for the absence of paternal involvement. Single parenthood had brought responsibilities that no amount of professional success could prepare her to handle. Every decision about Emma's education, medical care and social development rested solely on Victoria's judgment. Specialists offered conflicting advice about intervention strategies. Educational consultants recommended programs that contradicted recommendations from behavioral therapists. Insurance companies denied coverage for treatments that might genuinely help Emma progress. The most challenging aspect was Emma's communication differences, which created barriers that Victoria struggled to bridge despite her professional expertise in developing educational technology for special needs children. Emma's intelligence was undeniable, demonstrated through her remarkable ability to solve complex puzzles and her intuitive understanding of mathematical patterns. But traditional verbal communication remained elusive, leaving Victoria to interpret gestures, expressions and behaviors that sometimes felt like attempting to decode messages from an entirely different cognitive framework. Emma's meltdowns were the most heartbreaking moments for Victoria, episodes when sensory overload triggered responses that she felt powerless to prevent or soothe effectively. The sound of emergency sirens passing their building could send Emma into hours of distress. Unexpected changes in routine might result in self-injurious behaviors that broke Victoria's heart while filling her with helpless frustration. Victoria had read extensively about autism spectrum disorders, attended conferences in other cities, connected with online support groups, and experimented with every intervention technique available to parents in her situation. She'd consulted with developmental pediatricians at children's hospitals, hired private therapists who specialized in nonverbal communication, and purchased adaptive technology devices that promised breakthrough results for children like Emma. Yet the gulf between them often felt as vast as the distance between her executive suite and the service areas of the building where employees like Michael Torres worked invisibly to maintain the infrastructure that supported her corporate success. Emma responded to Victoria's efforts with polite tolerance rather than genuine engagement, accepting therapeutic activities and educational programs without displaying the enthusiasm or progress that Victoria desperately hoped to see. Late at night, when the penthouse was quiet except for the distant sounds of Austin traffic, Victoria sometimes sat in Emma's room watching her daughter sleep. In those peaceful moments, Emma's face relaxed into expressions that reminded Victoria of her own childhood, of quiet mornings when her father had explained how technology could solve problems and create opportunities for people who needed alternative approaches to learning and communication. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that her professional success in developing educational platforms for special needs children contrasted sharply with her struggles to connect with her own daughter. The adaptive learning systems she oversaw helped thousands of children with autism spectrum disorders make educational progress, but Emma showed little interest in the very products that had built their family's financial security. Victoria's wealth had provided access to the best therapeutic interventions, the most advanced educational technologies, and the most highly trained specialists available for autism treatment, but money couldn't purchase the emotional connection she craved with Emma, couldn't eliminate the barriers that autism created for traditional parent-child bonding, and couldn't guarantee that her daughter would ever develop the communication skills necessary for the kind of relationship Victoria had imagined when she'd first held Emma as an infant. The annual company picnic at Zilker Park represented Victoria's attempt to bridge her professional and personal worlds, creating an event that demonstrated family values while showcasing corporate culture. She'd planned every detail with characteristic precision: accessible activities for children with diverse needs, quiet spaces for sensory breaks, security measures that ensured safety without creating an atmosphere of surveillance. Emma's participation in public events required extensive preparation and constant monitoring. Victoria hired specialized childcare providers who understood autism spectrum behaviors, arranged backup plans for sensory overload episodes, and maintained emergency contacts with Emma's therapy team in case professional intervention became necessary. The morning of the picnic had begun according to Victoria's carefully orchestrated schedule. Emma had awakened at her usual time, followed her established routine for personal care and breakfast, and accepted Victoria's explanation that they would be attending a company event where she could explore outdoor environments while Victoria fulfilled professional obligations. As they'd driven toward Zilker Park, Victoria had reviewed her mental checklist for managing potential challenges, speech prepared for media interviews, contingency plans activated for crowd control issues, support staff positioned throughout the event area with clear instructions for assisting families with special needs children. Emma had sat in the passenger seat wearing her preferred noise-canceling headphones, focusing intently on her tablet display where geometric patterns shifted and evolved according to mathematical algorithms that she seemed to understand intuitively. These visual sequences provided comfort and cognitive stimulation that helped Emma process challenging environments without becoming overwhelmed by sensory input. Victoria had learned to interpret Emma's subtle behavioral cues that indicated stress levels and sensory processing states. The slight tension in her daughter's shoulders as they approached the park suggested awareness of approaching challenges, but Emma's willingness to engage with her tablet activities indicated manageable anxiety levels that wouldn't require immediate intervention. The park entrance had bustled with Hayes Digital Solutions families arriving for the picnic, children running toward playground equipment, while parents carried coolers, blankets, and portable chairs. Victoria had noticed several local news vehicles parked near the main pavilion, confirming that her public relations team had successfully generated media interest in the event. Emma had observed the gathering crowds through the car window, her expression remaining neutral while processing the sensory information of voices, movement, and unfamiliar visual stimuli. Victoria had recognized the careful assessment her daughter performed before entering new environments, a survival strategy that helped Emma navigate social situations that could quickly become overwhelming without proper preparation. The morning had progressed according to Victoria's timeline, with employees arriving in family groups, vendors setting up food stations and activity areas, and local musicians beginning sound checks for afternoon entertainment. Victoria had insisted on acoustic performances rather than amplified music, understanding that loud sounds could trigger distress for children like Emma who experienced auditory sensitivity. By 10:30, over 300 people had gathered in the designated picnic area, creating the kind of cheerful family atmosphere that Victoria hoped would generate positive media coverage while providing genuine enjoyment for her employees and their children. She'd moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, greeting key personnel, acknowledging family members she'd met at previous company events, and positioning herself for scheduled interviews with local business reporters. Emma had remained close to Victoria's side, occasionally reaching for her mother's hand when the sensory input became particularly intense. Victoria had arranged for a quiet retreat area near the park's community center, complete with comfortable seating, noise-dampening materials, and sensory tools that Emma could access if the event environment became too stimulating to manage comfortably. The first indication that the carefully planned event might encounter unexpected challenges had come when a local news reporter approached with questions that veered away from corporate culture and community engagement toward more personal territory about family life and work-life balance. Victoria's carefully prepared responses had suddenly felt inadequate when faced with inquiries that seemed designed to generate controversy rather than celebrate community involvement. As Victoria stood on the small stage addressing the gathered families, with Emma watching from the designated quiet area nearby, she'd had no way of anticipating that within hours, a series of events would unfold that would challenge every assumption she'd made about the people who worked for her company, the daughter she was trying so hard to understand, and the carefully controlled world she'd constructed to protect them both from the uncertainties that had shattered her life when her father died unexpectedly 3 years earlier. Victoria's relationships had become transactions measured in quarterly returns rather than emotional dividends. The penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Austin served as a monument to successful isolation, each piece of furniture positioned with mathematical precision to create visual harmony, while maintaining emotional distance from anything that might demand genuine vulnerability or spontaneous human connection. The dating circuit in Austin's technology community provided a steady stream of potential partners who approached Victoria with the same strategic mindset she applied to business acquisitions. Software entrepreneurs seeking collaboration opportunities disguised as romantic dinners, investment bankers proposing mergers that would benefit their portfolios while offering the appearance of personal commitment, politicians hoping to leverage her influence in education policy discussions while maintaining plausible deniability about their motivations. These carefully orchestrated encounters unfolded in Austin's finest restaurants, where conversations flowed like scripted presentations between professionals who understood that authentic emotion was a liability that could compromise negotiating positions. Victoria had perfected the art of appearing engaged while maintaining internal distance, asking questions that demonstrated interest without revealing personal information that might be used against her in future business dealings. Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist from Dallas, had pursued Victoria for 6 months with the persistence of someone accustomed to eventually acquiring whatever caught his attention. Their relationship consisted of monthly dinners at exclusive establishments where they discussed market trends, regulatory changes, and potential investment opportunities while maintaining the fiction that their association was romantically motivated rather than professionally strategic. Marcus possessed the kind of calculated charm that appealed to board members and media representatives, speaking in measured phrases that conveyed authority without revealing specific positions on controversial topics. His family had built wealth through commercial real estate development, providing him with social connections that could benefit Hayes Digital Solutions' expansion into new markets. During their dinners, Marcus would lean forward with practiced attentiveness while Victoria described challenges in the educational technology sector, his responses demonstrating thorough research into her company's competitive position and growth potential. He asked thoughtful questions about autism-focused learning platforms, nodding with appropriate concern when she mentioned the personal significance of developing tools for special needs children. But Victoria had learned to recognize the difference between genuine interest and performance art designed to achieve specific objectives. Marcus's questions about Emma always felt rehearsed, delivered with the kind of manufactured empathy that politicians display when discussing issues they've never personally experienced. His suggestions for managing Emma's autism reflected assumptions that her daughter was a problem requiring solutions rather than a person deserving understanding and acceptance. When Emma experienced meltdowns during their few encounters, Marcus had responded with polite tolerance that felt more insulting than outright rejection. He would excuse himself to take important phone calls during episodes that lasted longer than his patience, returning with apologetic smiles that suggested Emma's distress was an inconvenience that better planning could have prevented. The relationship had ended when Marcus suggested that Emma might benefit from more structured residential care that would allow Victoria to focus entirely on expanding Hayes Digital Solutions into international markets. His proposal had been delivered with the same tone he used for discussing portfolio optimization, as if Emma were an underperforming asset that required strategic reallocation to maximize overall returns. Victoria had realized in that moment that Marcus saw her daughter as an obstacle to the version of partnership he'd envisioned, one where their combined resources could build an empire unencumbered by the unpredictable demands of special needs parenting. His vision of their future together had no space for sensory meltdowns, therapy appointments, or the kind of unconditional love that Emma required to thrive. Robert Williams, a software executive from Seattle, had approached Victoria at a technology conference with proposals for collaboration between their companies. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into personal dinners and weekend visits that felt more like extended job interviews than romantic encounters. Robert's company specialized in artificial intelligence applications for educational assessment, creating potential synergies with Hayes Digital Solutions' adaptive learning platforms. His technical expertise impressed Victoria's development teams, and his industry connections provided access to research universities and government contracts that could accelerate their growth trajectory. But Robert's interest in Victoria seemed proportional to her company's market valuation, intensifying during quarters when their revenue exceeded projections and cooling when competitive pressures created temporary setbacks. His conversations about their relationship timeline consistently coincided with major business announcements or merger opportunities that could benefit his own company's strategic position. Emma's autism challenged Robert's vision of efficient partnership in ways that he struggled to accommodate gracefully. He would arrive for visits with detailed itineraries that assumed Emma could adapt to adult schedules and social expectations without accommodation for her sensory needs or communication differences. When Emma's behaviors disrupted his carefully planned weekend activities, Robert would respond with frustrated suggestions about better management strategies that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of autism spectrum disorders. He viewed Emma's stimming behaviors as voluntary choices that better parenting could eliminate, her communication challenges as problems that appropriate therapy could solve completely. The final break had occurred during a weekend trip to San Antonio that Robert had planned without consulting Victoria about Emma's specific needs. The hotel he'd selected featured busy lobbies with overwhelming sensory stimulation, restaurant dining rooms that couldn't accommodate Emma's dietary restrictions, and tourist attractions that were completely inappropriate for a child with autism. When Emma experienced a major meltdown in the hotel lobby, triggered by unexpected fire alarm sounds during a routine safety test, Robert had responded with visible embarrassment rather than supportive understanding. His primary concern seemed focused on the reactions of other guests rather than Emma's distress, suggesting they should consider alternative arrangements for future travel plans. Victoria had packed their belongings and driven home that evening, realizing that Robert's version of partnership required her to choose between his comfort and Emma's well-being. The man who spoke eloquently about inclusive technology design in professional settings couldn't extend that same inclusive thinking to accepting her daughter's neurological differences in personal contexts. The pattern repeated itself with other potential partners who approached Victoria through Austin's interconnected network of successful professionals. Each relationship began with promising conversations about shared values and compatible goals, but eventually revealed fundamental incompatibilities when faced with the reality of Emma's needs and Victoria's unwavering commitment to her daughter's well-being. These failed relationships reinforced Victoria's growing conviction that successful people in her social circle viewed children like Emma as inconvenient complications rather than human beings deserving love and acceptance. The same individuals who donated generously to autism research organizations at charity galas seemed incapable of extending basic courtesy to actual autistic children who didn't conform to their expectations of appropriate behavior. Victoria had gradually stopped accepting dinner invitations and social gatherings that couldn't accommodate Emma's presence, preferring isolation to the constant stress of managing other people's discomfort with her daughter's differences. The penthouse apartment became a sanctuary where Emma could follow her routines without judgment, where sensory needs took precedence over social expectations, where unconditional love didn't require justification or apology. The emotional cost of this isolation pressed down on Victoria like atmospheric pressure at ocean depths. Late at night, when Emma was sleeping peacefully in her carefully designed bedroom, Victoria would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Austin's skyline and wonder if she was providing her daughter with the best possible life or simply the safest possible isolation from a world that seemed incapable of accepting neurological differences. Professional success had given Victoria financial resources to access the best therapies, educational programs and support services available for autism treatment. But money couldn't purchase the genuine community acceptance that Emma needed to develop social connections and build relationships outside their carefully controlled domestic environment. Victoria's own social needs had withered under the constant pressure of advocating for Emma while managing a demanding corporation. The woman who had once enjoyed impromptu gatherings with college friends, who had spent weekends exploring Austin's music scene and cultural attractions, who had maintained close relationships with her father's colleagues and industry mentors, had gradually withdrawn from activities that couldn't accommodate Emma's participation. The few friendships that survived Victoria's transformation into a single mother focused on other parents navigating similar challenges with special needs children. These relationships provided practical support and emotional understanding, but they existed within the narrow boundaries of shared struggle rather than the broader foundation of common interests and compatible personalities that had characterized her social life before Emma's diagnosis. Emma's therapeutic team provided professional guidance and evidence-based interventions, but these clinical relationships couldn't fulfill Victoria's need for adult companionship and intellectual stimulation outside the context of autism advocacy and corporate management. The specialists who worked with Emma were skilled and dedicated, but their interactions with Victoria remained bounded by professional protocols that prevented genuine friendship from developing. Victoria had learned to find satisfaction in Emma's small victories and gradual progress rather than seeking validation through romantic relationships or social recognition. When Emma successfully navigated a challenging sensory environment, when she demonstrated new problem-solving skills, when she showed affection through her own unique communication style, Victoria experienced joy that surpassed any professional achievement or external recognition she'd received throughout her career. But the absence of adult partnership meant that Victoria carried the entire emotional weight of Emma's care without the support that shared responsibility could provide. Every decision about Emma's education, medical treatment, and social development rested solely on Victoria's judgment, creating constant pressure to make perfect choices for a child whose needs were often uncertain and whose future remained unpredictable. The isolation extended beyond romantic relationships to affect Victoria's professional interactions as well. Colleagues who had once invited her to industry conferences and networking events gradually stopped including her when they realized that her availability depended on Emma's needs and therapy schedules. Business trips required extensive planning for Emma's care, limiting Victoria's ability to pursue opportunities that demanded flexible travel and spontaneous availability. Victoria had restructured Hayes Digital Solutions operations to accommodate her parenting responsibilities, implementing remote work policies and flexible scheduling that benefited all employees while allowing her to maintain involvement in Emma's daily care. But these changes sometimes created tension with board members, who questioned whether personal considerations were influencing business decisions in ways that might compromise competitive advantage. The company's focus on educational technology for special needs children had intensified under Victoria's leadership, driven partly by her personal understanding of the challenges facing families like her own. This strategic direction had proven financially successful and socially meaningful, but it also meant that Victoria's professional identity became inseparably linked to her role as Emma's mother rather than standing independently as a technology executive. Victoria sometimes wondered if she was providing Emma with appropriate independence and social development opportunities, or if her protective instincts were limiting her daughter's exposure to experiences that might promote growth and resilience. The balance between advocacy and overprotection felt constantly uncertain, requiring decisions that had no clear right answers and permanent consequences that couldn't be reversed through strategic planning or corporate problem-solving methodologies. The annual company picnic at Zilker Park represented Victoria's attempt to create an environment where Emma could participate in community activities while remaining within the safety of familiar corporate culture. She had designed the event with autism-friendly accommodations, hoping to demonstrate that inclusive practices could benefit everyone while providing Emma with positive social experiences. As Victoria stood on the stage that morning, addressing employees and their families while Emma watched from the designated quiet area nearby, she felt the familiar weight of trying to balance multiple competing priorities: corporate leadership, public relations management, and maternal protection. The questions from the news reporter had caught her completely off guard, forcing split-second decisions about how to respond to implications that felt more like accusations than legitimate journalism. The words that came out of her mouth when she pointed toward Michael Torres and declared that she would never allow a janitor near her daughter reflected the defensive instincts that had protected her through years of skeptical board meetings, competitive business negotiations, and social encounters where Emma's autism made them targets for judgment and exclusion. But as Michael walked away from the gathering with quiet dignity that somehow made Victoria's declaration seem even more cruel, she felt something crack inside her chest. The man she had publicly dismissed based solely on his uniform and occupation had done nothing to deserve such treatment, yet her protective instincts had overridden her capacity for fairness and compassion. As the morning progressed and the picnic continued according to Victoria's carefully planned schedule, she found herself scanning the park for any sign of Michael, though she couldn't articulate why his presence or absence mattered to her. The maintenance shed remained closed, and she realized that her public statement had effectively banished him from participating in an event that was supposed to celebrate the entire Hayes Digital Solutions community. Emma remained unusually quiet throughout the morning activities, staying closer to Victoria than normal, and displaying increased sensitivity to the crowd noise and activity around them. Victoria attributed her daughter's behavior to the general stimulation of the picnic environment, not recognizing that Emma might have witnessed and processed the interaction with Michael Torres in ways that her mother couldn't understand. The afternoon entertainment was scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock, but as the crowds grew larger and the noise levels increased, Victoria noticed Emma becoming increasingly agitated. Her daughter's stimming behaviors intensified, and she began covering her ears despite wearing noise-canceling headphones that usually provided adequate sensory protection. Victoria recognized the signs of approaching sensory overload and began guiding Emma toward the quiet retreat area she'd established near the community center. The path to the retreat space required walking past the maintenance shed where Michael Torres had disappeared earlier that morning, and Victoria felt a complicated mix of guilt, curiosity, and something she couldn't quite identify as they approached the small building. Emma suddenly stopped walking, pulling away from Victoria's guiding hand and staring intently at something near the maintenance shed. Victoria followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual, just standard park maintenance equipment, gardening tools and storage containers that held supplies for events like their company picnic. But Emma's behavior suggested she'd noticed something significant, something that captured her attention in ways that social gatherings and corporate activities never could. Victoria had learned to pay attention to Emma's focused interest, understanding that her daughter often perceived details and patterns that escaped typical observation and might indicate important information that others had missed. As they stood there in the growing afternoon heat, with the sounds of the picnic continuing in the distance, and Emma's anxiety levels clearly escalating, despite the quieter environment, Victoria had no way of knowing that within the next few hours, a series of events would unfold that would challenge every assumption she'd made about the people working invisibly around her, the daughter she was trying so desperately to understand, and the carefully controlled world she'd constructed to protect them both from uncertainties that had shattered her life when her father died unexpectedly. The weight of isolation, professional responsibility, and single parenthood had never felt heavier than it did that afternoon at Zilker Park, though Victoria couldn't yet articulate why her successful company picnic felt like the beginning of something that would transform everything she thought she understood about strength, vulnerability, and the hidden connections that bind people together in ways that transcend social boundaries and professional hierarchies. The maintenance shed behind Zilker Park's community center existed in a shadow world that most visitors never noticed. While families enjoyed picnics and children played on brightly colored equipment, this utilitarian space housed the infrastructure that made recreational activities possible. Mowers for keeping grass fields pristine, pressure washers for cleaning sidewalks and pavilions, irrigation controls that maintained the verdant landscapes that attracted thousands of Austin residents to the park each weekend. Michael Torres understood invisible spaces better than most people. His 3 years working night shift at Hayes Digital Solutions had taught him the geography of places where important work happened without recognition or acknowledgement. Supply closets where cleaning materials were stored according to safety protocols that protected employees from chemical exposure. Utility rooms where servers hummed constantly to maintain digital connectivity for hundreds of corporate workstations. Corridors that remained empty after business hours but required meticulous maintenance to preserve the professional atmosphere that clients expected during daytime visits. The transition from respected child psychologist to invisible service worker had required fundamental adjustments in how Michael navigated physical and social spaces. In his former professional life, he had commanded attention in clinical settings, conference rooms, and academic environments where his expertise was valued and his opinions were solicited on complex cases involving children with autism spectrum disorders. Parents had sought his guidance, colleagues had requested his consultation, and research institutions had invited him to present findings at national conferences. Now he moved through environments where his presence was expected to remain unnoticed, where his knowledge and experience were irrelevant to his assigned responsibilities, where his personal history was neither known nor welcomed in conversations that focused on completing tasks efficiently rather than exploring intellectual challenges or helping vulnerable populations achieve their potential. The malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed his psychology practice had been built on Marcus Webb's fundamental misunderstanding of autism intervention strategies. Marcus had expected his son Timothy to achieve rapid progress through intensive behavioral modification programs that forced conformity to neurotypical communication patterns rather than honoring the child's unique cognitive processing style. Michael's approach had emphasized understanding Timothy's sensory experiences, respecting his communication preferences, and building therapeutic relationships based on trust rather than compliance. The methods had been producing steady improvements in Timothy's social engagement and emotional regulation, but the progress hadn't matched Marcus's expectations for dramatic transformation that would eliminate all visible signs of autism. When Marcus filed complaints with the state licensing board, alleging that Michael's unconventional methods had delayed Timothy's development, the accusations triggered investigations that consumed 18 months of Michael's life and depleted his financial resources. The legal proceedings required expert testimony, detailed documentation of therapeutic approaches, and extensive review of clinical records that demonstrated the effectiveness of Michael's interventions. Professional colleagues who had previously collaborated with Michael on research projects began distancing themselves from association with someone under investigation. Parents who had been satisfied with their children's progress started questioning whether they should seek alternative therapeutic services. The autism advocacy community, which had initially supported Michael's innovative approaches, became divided about whether defending him was worth the potential damage to their broader political objectives. The financial cost of legal representation had forced Michael to sell his home, liquidate his retirement savings, and eventually close his practice when insurance companies suspended coverage pending resolution of the licensing investigation. Jennifer had tried to maintain their household stability while Michael focused on clearing his name, but the stress had affected every aspect of their marriage. The most devastating consequence had been watching his relationship with Daniel deteriorate during those months when legal battles consumed Michael's emotional availability. His son, barely 2 years old when the crisis began, had needed consistent parenting attention that Michael couldn't provide while fighting to save his professional reputation and financial security. When the licensing board eventually cleared Michael of any wrongdoing, determining that his therapeutic approaches met appropriate standards of care and that Timothy's progress had been appropriate given his initial presentation, the vindication came too late to salvage his practice or his marriage. The legal expenses had left him bankrupt, his professional reputation had been permanently damaged by the public accusations, and Jennifer had already begun the process of rebuilding her life without him. The divorce settlement had awarded Jennifer primary custody of Daniel, with Michael receiving visitation rights during summers and selected holidays. The arrangement reflected the court's assessment that his employment instability made him unsuitable for shared custody, despite his cleared professional standing and demonstrated competence as a therapist specializing in child development. Jennifer's relocation to Colorado with Daniel had been presented as a career opportunity at a prestigious music conservatory, but Michael understood that the distance also provided protection from the ongoing complications of his damaged reputation. Her new husband, Dr. Richard Coleman, offered the stability and social respectability that Michael could no longer provide. Daniel spent 6 weeks each summer with Michael in Austin, precious time that had become the center of Michael's emotional life. These visits required careful planning to maximize their time together while maintaining the routines that helped Daniel feel secure transitioning between households. Michael had transformed his modest apartment into a space that could accommodate his son's interests, books appropriate for an advanced 7-year-old reader, art supplies for Daniel's creative projects, and musical instruments that honored Jennifer's influence in their son's education. During Daniel's visits, Michael temporarily regained access to the version of himself that had been lost during the malpractice crisis. His son's questions about science, literature, and human behavior provided opportunities to share knowledge and insights that his janitorial work never required. They would spend afternoons at Austin's museums and libraries, exploring exhibits that sparked conversations about psychology, technology, and the ways that people with different abilities contributed to their communities. Daniel had inherited Jennifer's musical sensitivity and Michael's analytical approach to understanding complex systems. At 7, he could already read simple musical notation, and had begun composing melodies that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of harmonic relationships. But he also showed Michael's careful attention to emotional dynamics, often asking perceptive questions about why some people seemed sad or worried, and whether there were ways to help them feel better. These conversations reminded Michael of his former professional purpose, helping children understand their own experiences while developing empathy for others who might process the world differently. Daniel's natural curiosity about autism spectrum disorders, sparked by stories about Michael's former patients, suggested that his son might eventually pursue similar helping professions. The janitorial position at Hayes Digital Solutions had been offered by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a former colleague who remembered Michael's expertise and understood that his professional downfall had been undeserved. Sarah worked as a consulting psychologist for technology companies developing educational software, and she had recommended Michael for the maintenance position when she learned about his financial circumstances. The work itself provided meditation-like qualities that helped Michael process the trauma of losing his career and family. Repetitive tasks allowed his mind to focus on concrete problems with clear solutions, unlike the ambiguous challenges of clinical psychology or the emotional complexities of failed marriage. Empty the waste baskets, check supply inventories, polish fixtures until they reflected light without streaks or smudges. During quiet evening hours when the building was empty except for security guards, Michael sometimes paused at displays showcasing Hayes Digital Solutions' educational software platforms. The company's mission focused on developing adaptive learning technologies for children with special needs, including autism spectrum disorders. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his nights maintaining a facility dedicated to helping children like those he had once treated professionally. Victoria Hayes's public rejection at the company picnic had stung more than Michael had expected, though he understood her defensive reaction. As a single mother protecting an autistic daughter, she would naturally be suspicious of any male employee whose background she didn't know. Her concern was reasonable, even if her public expression of it had been unnecessarily harsh. But Michael had observed Emma Hayes during his evening shifts in ways that Victoria never realized. When mother and daughter occasionally worked late in Victoria's office, Michael could see through security camera monitors that Emma displayed many of the same behavioral patterns he had learned to recognize in his former patients, stimming behaviors that helped regulate sensory input, communication preferences that relied on gestures rather than verbal language, an intense focus on activities that provided predictable structure. Emma's autism manifested differently from Timothy Webb's presentation, but Michael recognized the underlying neurological patterns that created challenges with social interaction, sensory processing, and communication development. Her intelligence was obvious in the way she solved complex puzzles and manipulated technological interfaces, but she struggled with the unpredictable social demands that neurotypical children navigated instinctively. Michael had never approached Victoria about Emma's autism or offered unsolicited advice about therapeutic interventions. His position as night janitor created professional boundaries that made such conversations inappropriate, and his damaged reputation made it unlikely that Victoria would welcome input from someone she viewed as merely a service employee. But he had noticed details about Emma's behavior that suggested she was making progress in areas that might not be obvious to someone without specialized training in autism spectrum assessment. Her increasing comfort with transitioning between activities, her growing tolerance for environmental changes, and her developing awareness of other people's emotional states indicated therapeutic interventions that were producing positive results. The afternoon of the company picnic, Michael had been completing maintenance tasks at the park's community center when he heard commotion from the main gathering area. Families were calling names, search parties were forming, and park security guards were coordinating systematic coverage of playground areas and walking trails. Emma Hayes was missing. She had disappeared from the designated quiet retreat area where Victoria had left her while conducting media interviews. The 8-year-old had vanished into the maze of Zilker Park's diverse environments, wooded areas, open fields, recreational facilities and infrastructure buildings that offered countless hiding places for a child seeking escape from overwhelming sensory stimulation. Michael understood immediately that traditional search methods might not be effective for finding an autistic child experiencing crisis. Emma wouldn't respond to strangers calling her name, wouldn't emerge from hiding places when beckoned by unfamiliar voices, and might actually retreat deeper into whatever sanctuary she had found if approached by large groups of searchers who didn't understand her communication style and sensory needs. Without hesitation, Michael abandoned his assigned duties and joined the search effort. He approached the crisis from his professional background, rather than his current employment status, analyzing Emma's likely behavior patterns based on his clinical experience with children who shared similar neurological characteristics. Autistic children who became overwhelmed in social situations typically sought environments that provided sensory regulation, quiet spaces with minimal visual stimulation, areas where they could engage in self-soothing behaviors without interruption, locations that offered predictable structure rather than chaotic uncertainty. The maintenance shed where Michael had been working fit many of these criteria. The building was isolated from crowd noise, contained organized equipment that created visual patterns, and offered secure enclosure that could feel protective rather than threatening to a child seeking refuge from overwhelming stimulation. Michael approached the shed quietly, understanding that sudden sounds or movements might startle Emma into further retreat if she was indeed hiding inside. He spoke softly as he opened the door, using the calm tone he had developed during years of working with autistic children who were experiencing distress. Emma was sitting on the floor behind a stack of gardening equipment, her knees pulled to her chest in a defensive posture that Michael recognized as self-protective positioning. Her eyes were closed, and she was rocking slightly in a rhythm that helped regulate her nervous system. She wasn't crying or calling for help, but her body language clearly indicated that she was overwhelmed and unable to return to the social environment without support. Michael sat down slowly several feet away from Emma, not attempting to make eye contact or initiate conversation that might increase her stress levels. Instead, he began speaking quietly about the equipment in the shed, describing the patterns and organization systems that had created the orderly environment where Emma had sought refuge. After several minutes, Emma opened her eyes and looked at Michael with the careful assessment that autistic children often performed when encountering new people. She didn't speak, but her body posture relaxed slightly, suggesting that she recognized his non-threatening approach and calm demeanor. Michael continued talking softly about neutral topics, the way sunlight filtered through the shed's windows, the interesting shapes created by shadows on the wall, the mathematical patterns visible in the arrangement of tools and supplies. These observations matched the kind of environmental details that often captured Emma's attention and provided comfort during stressful situations. Gradually, Emma's rocking motion slowed, and her breathing became more regular. She maintained visual contact with Michael while processing his presence and assessing whether he represented safety or additional threat. Her response suggested that his calm approach was helping her nervous system begin the process of regulatory recovery. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried weight that would transform everything Victoria thought she understood about her daughter's awareness and perception. Emma had witnessed something during the morning's events that adults had missed, something that revealed hidden truths about the people working around her and the complex social dynamics that shaped her daily environment. The information Emma shared in that quiet moment would challenge Victoria's assumptions about protective parenting, corporate responsibility, and the invisible connections that bind communities together. But first, Michael needed to help Emma feel safe enough to return to her mother, who was coordinating search efforts with growing panic and desperation. Michael's years of professional experience had taught him that autistic children often process social situations with remarkable accuracy, perceiving emotional undercurrents and behavioral patterns that neurotypical observers missed. Emma's whispered revelation would prove that assumption correct in ways that none of the adults searching for her could have anticipated. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Zilker Park and search teams expanded their coverage to areas beyond the immediate picnic grounds, Michael sat patiently with Emma in the maintenance shed, understanding that rushing her recovery process would only create additional trauma. The child who had been dismissed by her mother as needing protection from people like him was about to become the bridge that connected two damaged adults who both understood what it meant to be misunderstood by a world that judged them based on appearances rather than character. The crisis that had begun with Victoria's public rejection of Michael Torres was approaching resolution through Emma's quiet wisdom and Michael's professional expertise, though neither parent could have predicted that their daughter's disappearance would become the catalyst for revelations that would change their understanding of family, community, and the hidden strengths that people carry within themselves even when the world refuses to see their true value. Emma's whispered words carried the weight of secrets that adults had failed to recognize, observations made by a mind that processed social dynamics with crystalline clarity, despite her struggles with conventional communication. In the quiet sanctuary of the maintenance shed, surrounded by orderly equipment that provided visual comfort and sensory predictability, she finally felt safe enough to share what she had witnessed during months of careful watching and listening. Michael remained perfectly still as Emma spoke, understanding that any sudden movement or change in his calm demeanor might cause her to retreat back into protective silence. His years of clinical experience had taught him that autistic children often possessed remarkable awareness of their environments, perceiving emotional undercurrents and behavioral patterns that neurotypical observers completely missed. Emma's voice was barely audible, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision that characterized her approach to communication when she felt genuinely safe. She described incidents she had observed at school, interactions between teachers and administrators that revealed systematic problems with how autistic children were being treated within the educational system that was supposedly designed to support their unique needs. The elementary school principal, Dr. Margaret Foster, had been implementing policies that violated federal guidelines for special education services. Emma had witnessed conversations in administrative offices during therapy sessions, overhearing discussions about budget reductions that involved cutting support services for children with autism spectrum disorders, while maintaining programs for students whose needs were less expensive to accommodate. Emma described seeing Dr. Foster meeting with parents of neurotypical children, promising them that disruptive autistic students would be transferred to separate classrooms where their behaviors wouldn't interfere with traditional learning environments. These conversations happened during lunch periods when Emma was receiving occupational therapy in nearby offices, her exceptional hearing allowing her to process discussions that adults assumed no children could overhear. More disturbing, Emma had observed Dr. Foster documenting false reports about autistic students' behaviors, exaggerating incidents of aggression or self-injury, to justify recommendations for residential placement that would remove these children from mainstream educational settings entirely. The principal was systematically building cases against families like Victoria's, creating paper trails that could be used to deny appropriate educational services. Michael listened with growing concern as Emma described specific incidents involving her classmates. Tommy Martinez, a nonverbal autistic boy in her grade, had been restrained by school security during a sensory meltdown rather than receiving the calming intervention strategies outlined in his individualized education plan. The incident had been reported as violent resistance to instruction rather than recognizing it as predictable response to overwhelming environmental stimuli. Sarah Chen, another autistic student, had been denied access to her communication device during standardized testing, despite federal requirements that assistive technology be available for students who relied on alternative communication methods. When Sarah's parents questioned the policy, Dr. Foster had suggested that their daughter might be better served in a specialized facility, rather than continuing in mainstream educational placement. Emma's detailed descriptions revealed systematic discrimination that was being carefully disguised as educational policy. Dr. Foster was using her administrative authority to eliminate special needs students who required additional resources, creating more favorable student-teacher ratios and higher standardized test scores that enhanced her professional reputation while devastating families who trusted the system to support their children's development. Michael realized that Emma's autism had actually provided her with unique advantages in gathering this information. Her need for predictable routines meant she was often present in administrative areas during therapy sessions and individualized education plan meetings. Her tendency to remain quiet and still made adults forget she was present during conversations they assumed were private. Her exceptional memory for details meant she could recall specific dates, names and policy violations with accuracy that would be crucial for any investigation. The most shocking revelation came when Emma described overhearing Dr. Foster discussing Victoria Hayes specifically during a phone conversation with someone at the district administrative offices. The principal had identified Emma as a potential target for residential placement recommendations, citing her mother's demanding schedule and high-profile corporate position as evidence that home-based support was inadequate for meeting Emma's complex needs. Dr. Foster had been building a case against Victoria's parenting capacity, documenting every late pickup from school, every therapy appointment that required schedule adjustments, every instance when Emma's behaviors deviated from neurotypical expectations. The principal was preparing to recommend that Emma be removed from her mother's care and placed in institutional settings that would eliminate the school's responsibility for providing appropriate special education services. Michael understood immediately that Emma's information revealed criminal violations of federal disability rights laws, systematic fraud in educational reporting, and conspiracy to deny appropriate services to vulnerable children. The evidence Emma had gathered through her unique observational position could expose corruption that was affecting dozens of families throughout the Austin school district. But the complexity of Emma's situation required careful handling. As an autistic child, her testimony would face skepticism from investigators who might question her reliability as a witness. The very characteristics that had allowed her to gather this information would be used by defense attorneys to challenge her credibility, if the case ever reached formal legal proceedings. Michael also recognized that Emma's revelations placed her in potential danger. If Dr. Foster discovered that her discriminatory practices had been observed and documented, she might accelerate her efforts to remove Emma from the school environment before investigations could be initiated. The principal possessed significant administrative power that could be used to retaliate against families who challenged her authority. As Emma finished sharing her observations, Michael faced a critical decision about how to proceed with information that could transform not only her educational experience but the lives of numerous other autistic children who were being systematically denied appropriate services. The janitor, who had been publicly dismissed as inappropriate for contact with children, was now the sole adult who understood the scope of corruption affecting the very system that was supposed to protect vulnerable students. Emma's trust in Michael represented a breakthrough that transcended their brief interaction in the maintenance shed. Her willingness to share sensitive information with someone she had just met demonstrated her intuitive recognition that he possessed the knowledge and character necessary to help her navigate complex social challenges that her mother didn't fully understand. Michael's response to Emma's revelations would need to balance immediate safety concerns with long-term strategic planning for exposing systemic abuse. He couldn't act on the information without Victoria's knowledge and consent, but he also couldn't allow Dr. Foster's discrimination to continue affecting Emma and her classmates, while bureaucratic processes slowly addressed the violations. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across Zilker Park as search teams continued looking for Emma in areas far from the maintenance shed where she sat safely with Michael. Victoria's voice could be heard in the distance, coordinating with park security and calling Emma's name with increasing desperation as time passed without any sign of her missing daughter. Michael knew that returning Emma to her mother would require careful explanation of how he had found her and why she had chosen to trust him with information that could transform their understanding of the challenges she faced at school. The revelation would force Victoria to reconsider her assumptions about Michael's character and capabilities while processing disturbing truths about institutions she had trusted to support Emma's development. Emma's autism had initially seemed like a barrier to communication and understanding, but her unique neurological wiring had actually provided her with observational advantages that typical children wouldn't possess. Her detailed memory, her sensitivity to emotional dynamics, and her presence in administrative settings had created perfect conditions for gathering evidence of systematic discrimination that adults had failed to recognize. The whispered secret that Emma shared in the quiet sanctuary of the maintenance shed would become the catalyst for exposing corruption, protecting vulnerable children, and bridging the gap between two parents who both understood what it meant to fight for their children's rights in systems that often seemed designed to exclude rather than include families like theirs. As Michael prepared to help Emma return to the search teams looking for her, he understood that her revelations had transformed a simple rescue mission into the beginning of a complex investigation that would require all of his professional expertise, Victoria's corporate resources, and Emma's continued courage to see justice served for the children who had been harmed by Dr. Foster's discriminatory practices. The maintenance shed had become an unlikely sanctuary where truth had been spoken and trust had been established between an autistic child and the man who understood her unique gifts better than anyone else in her daily environment. Emma's whispered words had revealed that sometimes the people society dismisses as least important are actually those with the greatest capacity to see clearly through deception and speak truth that others lack the courage or awareness to acknowledge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.